Hey, what's happening, Multifamily Network? A quick few announcements for you before we hop into this robust episode with the legendary Matt Ames. Very excited. Please stay tuned for that. 30 seconds of updates. Just want to let you know there were some technical difficulties at the beginning of this one where there might be a little echo here and there. Nothing that's going to be super annoying or anything like that for anybody, but if you do hear that in there when Keith or myself are talking, please forgive the audio. But luckily, when the great Matt Ames is speaking, you don't get any of that. So we appreciate your patience in that. And one more thing, if any of you out there are curious about managed Wi-Fi, want to get involved in the managed Wi-Fi business, you're an ISP that's looking into getting into multifamily, hasn't pulled the trigger on that yet, and you're looking for a partner to help you into that, give us a call over at Blueport. Go to loveyournetwork.com. Again, that's loveyournetwork.com. I want to let you know we can get you a multi-family MDU managed Wi-Fi toolkit. Again, that's a managed Wi-Fi toolkit that'll teach you all of the things that you need to get started in the MDU managed Wi-Fi business. Remember that managed Wi-Fi connectivity and prop tech really rule the world right now. And again, if you're a partner at ISP, any other type of partner in the space looking to get into managed Wi-Fi, let us get you set up with that managed Wi-Fi toolkit. Go to loveyournetwork.com. Again, loveyournetwork.com, or give me a call directly, shoot me a text. Happy to help. All right.
I think the conversation starts here. I don't even know that I'd tee it up real big. The most popular thing said was, I'm not an attorney, but, right? So, hey, we got one. So, I'm really interested, Matt, like when you hear somebody say, and even in the conversation, they even referred to managed Wi-Fi as a utility. Like, what goes through your head? Because I gotta believe there's ramifications behind that, or maybe there's not. Because again, I'm not.
Well, there isn't. I mean, when I hear people, I think we all know what we mean. I think, and I think what we mean is it's an essential service. Everybody has to have it, right? I think that's what, when people say it's a utility, I think that's what they're saying. At least that's what I hear, right? And so, and I think that's generally what people understand it to mean. And there's no real harm in that, but it's also not accurate because public utility has a legal meaning. And so I think it's, generally speaking, it's better to be talking about things using the right words just to avoid any confusion. So, I mean, as a practical matter, I think people know what it means. But, if you were to get into a technical conversation with somebody, you'd be better off using words that don't have a technical meaning, because otherwise, you could inadvertently say something you don't mean, and it does have implications.
So can I just put my cards on the table, and then you can spend the next however long you want calling me dumb if you'd like. But when I hear it, I hear lazy marketing. And I call it lazy marketing because on one hand it benefits us, but then on the other hand, we now invite these regulators into the conversation if we're talking about a utility. And that scares me to death. Right? Like, there's nobody I want to have less involvement in my life than our Congress. Right? So makes me nervous. That's the implication I hear. That's cards on the table where Keith's head is.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that. I mean, it's not like the FCC is listening in on this conversation, or are they? Well, never mind. I didn't say that. I'm sure they're not, but it's not like they're watching the broadband community conference or attending or anything like that. So we're not having that kind of conversation. But if I were at a meeting with the FCC, I would never use the word utility or public utility in talking about broadband, because that's what I was saying. It does have implications. So if you're having a technical conversation, you don't want to use a technical term without carefully considering what it is that you're saying. And so, as a general practice, I think it's better off. People are better off saying something other than, you could say it's like a utility in some ways, but that's why I say if we just use the term, it's an essential service. Now, maybe people disagree on that, but the FCC does look at it that way, and Congress is looking at it that way. That's why they're spending all the money on on BEAD and why we have the ACP. That's one thing coming out of the pandemic that has sort of become maybe not a universally accepted policy, but pretty widely accepted.
So the poll that spawned the phone call to ask you to come have this conversation was, is it dangerous to refer to internet as a utility? What is your straight take on just that question as it's posed?
Well, I don't like it. Yeah, I mean, because of the implications. I mean, let me just start. let me pull out my prop.
Okay.
That's my prop. All right.
All right, let's hear it.
And when I was growing up, I have 4 siblings, and my dad wasn't a lawyer, but he was he wanted to make sure we knew how to think. And so if someone would say something he disagreed with, or he'd call you on it, and there's any number of times that he'd say, "All right, go get the dictionary," and someone would have to get up. It was usually me because I was the oldest, so I had to go up and get the dictionary. That's why I'm doing this today, I guess. But anyway, so there's a bunch of words in here on what is a utility. If you just look up utility, but then it says a public utility, and then it says a commodity or service such as electricity, water, or public transportation that is provided by a public utility. So the dictionary says if you say utility in the telecom context, in that kind of context, you must be referring to a public utility. And that gets into the whole question of what's a public utility. And the problem with the phrase today is that in the telecom world, we've been going through 30 years now, pretty much, really way more, where we're saying that telecom is not a public utility, and broadband that's never been regulated as a public utility. So if you are saying that it ought to be, that broadband ought to be a public utility, and someone takes you literally, you're basically saying we should introduce a regulatory policy that's over 100 years old and that we're not implementing now. So in that sense, it's dangerous if you're using it that way and you have that kind of conversation.
Okay, so, but even if they don't mean it that way, I don't mean it that way.
Right.
I still feel like it's dangerous because you're just training the market to, you say something enough times it becomes true.
Well, right. No, that's a good point. Yeah, no, I that's a perfectly good point. I mean, but now, so then now you're getting into the question of what should the policy be, right? I mean, if the governments, if you believe that every single American should have broadband at home, right?
Yeah.
Or at least a smart device that they can use at home. Of course, there's a whole can of worms right there, right?
Right.
I mean, what is it that we're promoting? But let's just go with the first one because that's like the broadest, right? So everyone should have broadband at home and because broadband is a utility, because I think that everybody should have fiber to the home. I mean, that's part of the problem, right? It's like there's so many ways of getting there. It's like you don't even know what you're talking about in terms of the technology.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's a technical question right there.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned managed Wi-Fi earlier. Well, that's not really the issue, is it? It's broadband,
right,
that people want. I mean, if I'm living in, if we're not there yet, it seems to me we're going to be in the point, and this is why managed Wi-Fi is working for people. I mean, I don't care what you call it. I just want to turn on my device and have a speed that is fast enough that I can't notice, right? As a user, right? As a user, that's what I want. And, you'll always have the 10% of guys, who have to have whatever the latest and greatest is. And they'll debate you on what that is. We all know, I mean, you may be those people. I don't know. I'm not, but you know what I'm saying. So there are going to be those people, but the other 90% of us are like, I just want the thing to work. So the technology thing is sort of secondary, but when you say something like managed Wi-Fi ought to be utility, well, that doesn't really make any sense from a policy perspective because you picked the technology. So
talk to me about implications of this. So you said the implications of it are bad.
Okay.
Matt Passalacqua likes to say magic wand, right? So magic wand, it's been voted on, it's done, it's a public utility. What's the implication now to the owners and operators that you represent?
Okay, so the most important concept to understand here is that we're talking about regulation under a system that, like I said, is over 100 years old, and it's the way the phone companies, the bell companies used to be regulated, and it's the way gas and electric and water are typically regulated today. And the assumption is that that it's a monopoly. It's a monopoly, and we want it to be available to everybody, but because it's a monopoly, we have to regulate it, and we have to set the conditions of service. We have to have rate regulation. There's all sorts of things that come with that whole scheme. But that's what a public utility is. It's a company that's been given a monopoly to provide a certain service to the public, and it accepts a significant level of regulation in return for that monopoly and the other conditions that are put on it. So that's, and like I said, the bell companies used to be regulated that way. So, it can work, but we decided a long time ago we want competition. And so the danger is you start training people towards the concept of, well, it ought to be available to everybody, and it ought to be a certain level of service, whatever that is in terms of gigabyte up and down or whatever it is. Verizon would be delighted
right
to return to that kind of system if they could make it work, right? So it's not like it's an impossible thing to do. It used to be that way, and the government could decide if it wanted to go. I don't see it happening politically, but once as you said earlier, Keith, if you start putting the idea in people's heads and you repeat it enough, then maybe someone picks up on it.
So then, is revenue share, is that a part of the past when it becomes a utility?
That's an interesting question. I mean, well, yeah, because probably. I mean, we're speaking totally hypothetically now, but the concept was always that the government is determined that everybody should have this. And so we're regulating your rates. So that raises a complication right there,
right?
In terms of paying a revenue share. But the other thing was that part of the deal was universal service, right? And that's why we had the subsidy built into the system for rural service and small town service and so forth. And urban customers paid more on average than they needed to get the service, because there was a subsidy built into the system to pay for extending service in less dense areas under the monopoly system. And so the government would probably not want, there are two aspects to it. One is the government probably would not want the companies paying a revenue share, because that money ought to be going to expand the network, right?
Right.
And at the same time, if you're going to a monopoly system, what choice does the owner have? If I'm the provider, it's like, why am I going to pay you? Right.
Right.
And by the way, I have a universal service obligation. So how are we going to meet that? Is that going to be accompanied by some kind of mandatory access regulation? So we have universal mandatory access. I mean, you could have a system that worked perfectly well, if you don't care about competition, where it says, mandatory access. We'll get around the Fifth Amendment issue somehow. And it won't really matter because the owner doesn't have a choice anyway. We've eliminated competition. I mean, maybe everybody has little pockets. So we'll take, we'll divide each state up into service areas, and within that service area, there's a single provider, but maybe there's 5 providers in the state or whatever. I'm just making that up, obviously. But anyway, so when you talk about revenue share, I think that I don't, right now, it's the owner saying, you're on my property, I have choices, I built the place, and I think, we should have a cooperative relationship. And the way we make that cooperative is you pay me a little bit, so on and so forth. We all know how that works. If it were a public utility, everything changes. The whole system changes.
I feel like it breaks a lot of things. I'm not sure what it makes.
Oh yeah.
Better.
I mean, I don't want to even suggest it's. I mean, look, it's a weird thing, right? Because we've put in an enormous amount of capital in the country into building so many duplicate networks. I mean, Comcast and Verizon are competing head to head in Verizon's service area and most of Verizon's service area. So we have 2 wires when one would do, right? But at the same, so is that economically efficient? Well, I guess an economist would say, well, competition helps. Although if it's just a duopoly, does it help that much? I don't know, right? But you could certainly have a system where there's just one provider. But we decided a long time ago that we wanted competition, and I think the public. I mean, if you try to go back to that, I think there'd be a lot of political resistance.
A lot of outrage.
People want choices. I certainly wouldn't advocate it.
Yeah, I can't get past. I mean, because certainly managed Wi-Fi, I think, would suffer. The owners of these buildings would suffer from a revenue perspective, right? Because as it is, if they'll pay for the infrastructure, then they can basically buy it in bulk and sell it at retail, right? So they have a substantial impact to their NOI that I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think you're legally allowed to do that with power, right?
Right.
Somebody would take issue with it. So now it's a utility. We're not going to let you make that money off of it. That's not right. And frankly, I just don't think the solutions would be as good. I just don't.
I think that's right. I mean, just take managed Wi-Fi. I mean, managed Wi-Fi as a technology, the phone company, the cable company, whoever it is, whoever the monopolist would be, could certainly implement that as a solution. Obviously, they could do that. Mm-hmm. But, would it be the best managed Wi-Fi? That would depend, I guess, on what their rate of return was. And, how did the regulatory system work in terms of giving them that rate of return, right? And if someone else could provide it, the equivalent service for less, well, they're too bad, they're out of the market.
Right.
So the innovation has been the biggest advantage that people have gotten out of the change in the system back in the 90s.
So you keep referring to the monopoly, and again, I don't know, but does by virtue of it being a utility have to be a monopoly then?
Well, that's the concept underlying the whole thing. I mean, I don't think. I mean, let me make a couple of separate points or related points. Under the law today, in most states, telecom service is probably still falls within the definition of a public utility, because they never changed anything, and because it still has some relevance to the extent that they're running their copper networks, but a lot of that regulation has gone away. But the main thing is that the laws haven't been changed. So if you look in Virginia law, there's a definition of a public service company or a public service corporation, and then it lists, who can be a public service corporation, and it says water, sewer, gas, electric, and I can't remember if it says telephone or telecommunications, one or the other. It doesn't list broadband, right? But it does list telephone or telecommunications. But at the same time, the state regulators, because of the 96 Act and other things, have basically, they're not implementing the same kinds of rules that they do with respect to electric, for example.
Okay.
So that's why I talk about monopoly. If you're going to call something a public utility, you are by definition saying that there's a monopoly provider, because that's just the way the system works.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's the implication that you're creating, that you think there should be a monopoly provider. I mean, just think of the way electricity is regulated, and that's that's the closest example, or gas, but but electricity is really a very clear example. I mean, you've always been able in some way to resell phone service in a way, that because it's low voltage. I mean,
right.
But you don't have to put in a bunch of transformers. It's a cost problem with electricity. But anyway, so that's why I refer to monopoly. So under state law, you've got this question, right? I mean, arguably it is still, because the law hasn't changed in all respects. So when you look at some of these definitions, it'll list all the others, and it still includes telephone or telecom. But as a practical matter, or the way the rules have been changed because of the 96 Act and other factors, telecommunications has been pulled out. Right. And of course, broadband typically doesn't even appear. And cable is a good example, because cable historically was never considered a utility. When it first came on the scene, it was just television. Why would television be a utility that everybody has to have, right? Right. And if you want to get the 3 channels or whatever it was, you didn't need. It was just a box with sticks sticking out of it. So aluminum, Anyway, so cable was never considered a utility, and it only would be now because of the broadband.
Right.
So that's the thing, and of course, and cable was originally you could grant a monopoly franchise for cable, but in 80 or 92, I guess they took that away. So there's an example. Yeah, I mean, they provide broadband. They used to be a monopoly, but they're no longer allowed to have monopolies. And telecom's the same way.
So would it be fair to say that if I asked you the question, who's the biggest winner, should internet become a utility, it's going to be whoever wins that contract to be the monopoly, right?
Yeah, I mean, the government would have to decide how you are going to do that. I don't have no idea how that would be done. I mean, that's why it's just not going to happen. But you're creating other implications when you talk about a public, because you're just raising the possibility that you think rates should be regulated. I mean, that's one of the key. Aside from the reason that you regulate rates is because there's a monopoly. But maybe you think they should be regulated for some. They shouldn't go above a certain cap. I'm just making this up, but sure. It's like no provider should be allowed to charge more than. Okay, here's a scenario. Okay, all right, yeah, forget the monopoly thing. That's too complicated. We're not going to try to go all the way back in time. But it is an essential service, and it's like a utility, because utility rates, your electric rate, your water rate, your gas rate, are all regulated pretty much. Right. They're all regulated, and so we should regulate broadband rates, and we'll tell the states, yeah, you should start regulating broadband rates, and we'll have multiple providers. They can be whoever they want to be. But nobody can charge anybody more than, $20 a month for broadband.
I think they're going to stop providing broadband in a number of places.
Well, there you go. Now I made that number up, obviously, but right, but the way it works is the way it would work is that, because this is the way it used to work for telephone, and this is what the electric companies have to do. They go into the state. In Virginia, it's the State Corporation Commission, the Public Service Commission, Public Utility Commission, depending on which state you're in, and they have a proceeding like the FCC would, and it's like, okay, justify your rates, and there's a whole set of rules for how you're allowed to set rates in the first place, and then you want an increase, okay. What's the justification for the increase? And you have to prove it.
Yeah, I think it goes right back to your point though, Matt, because it's going to have to be a monopoly, because otherwise it's going to cost me 20 grand across the street and there's only 5 houses over there. I'll never make my money back. That neighborhood's screwed, right?
Right.
But if I get everybody, then I'll suck up the 20 grand and, bore under the street to get there, I guess.
Right. No, well, here's another good example. Okay. Just since you brought that along the lines of what you just talked about. A lot of my work is cable franchising representing local governments. And there's almost always, unless it's, well, there's some examples. Most franchises have some kind of build-out requirement.
Sure.
Okay. And it's typical in the case of, you lay it like a medium-sized city, it'll say you got to provide service to everybody. There's some exceptions, but basically the presumption is you got to serve everybody. But you get into a suburban county or an ex-urban area, then obviously you have to have some kind of a density requirement. And it used to be up until around 2005, 2006, that when you were renewing a cable franchise, the locality would try to bring that number down. So the number might be 20 homes per linear mile, right?
Okay.
So if you get to 21 homes, you have to build. If it's 19 homes, you don't have to build. And so the locality would say, well, you've been at 20 homes and you've been here for 20 years. We know you made your money back, right?
Right.
We'd like you to go to 15 because we got some people out there. You've got 90% of the county covered, but we got a couple thousand people out there that are on satellite and it's crappy, and we want to help them. And so we'd have a conversation, and you could sometimes there was a period when the companies, the MSOs were willing to come down a bit, and maybe you'd get to 18, 19. Not a big difference between 20 and 18 or 19, but at the margin you might get a couple hundred people, and or if someone's building out at the edge, new subdivision, a mile away, but it's dense, and so you can see how that works.
Right.
Well, what happens is Verizon and AT&T, they get the arms twisted enough by the FCC that, okay, we'll get into the broadband business. We're going to, start building fiber everywhere. Well, so these days, never mind changes in the law. I mean, Verizon got the law changed, for example, in Virginia to set a minimum of 30 homes per mile. But never mind that problem. What ends up happening is now you've got two companies splitting the market. So all of a sudden your density at 20 is 40. It effectively 40?
Yeah.
Right? So all kinds of changes happen when you've got competition, and some of them go one way and some of them go the other way, right? So if you've got two competitors, now all of a sudden no one wants to serve the outer edge.
Right.
No one wants to go there, and you can't make them. Right?
Yeah.
Unless you subsidize, unless you have the money to subsidize. Whereas, that's where BEAD and all this other stuff comes in. But anyway, but if it's a public utility and there's only one provider, that's a different story.
Interesting. I never thought of the implications of it needing to be more of a monopoly to make it successful as a utility.
Right.
But it would have to be. That is interesting. So, Passalacqua, I know we were getting an echo off of you, so you muted yourself. I've never heard you this quiet for this length of time. It's making me nervous. You want to unmute and chime in?
What I wanted to get at, regarding the BEAD, you couldn't hear me due to the technical errors I was having. But what I was interested in learning, and maybe I'm just paranoid. What I'm getting at with the BEAD funding and everything else, do we think that is a directional move to motivate the adoption of it becoming a utility? Now, I spent some time with another outfit doing a lot of that network expansion work, doing a lot of the BEAD funding stuff, preparing for that first wave of funding, the ARPA stuff, the CSF grant stuff on the West Coast. And there was, a lot of different requirements and things that came with it that met or were very similar to some of the things that you mentioned as far as how many people you have to service, how often you can raise a price. And if you do raise a price, it's got to be justified, but it has to be locked in this. If you're taking our money, then you have to do this, right? Which, I mean, look, if someone's giving you some funding, that's only fair. But what I'm getting at, I'm a little long-winded here, is with this initiation, at $42+ billion nationwide, do we believe that that's going to come with a little bit more of a gotcha? And if not a gotcha, a more adoptive approach that, hey, this is becoming a utility and moving in that direction. Am I making sense in my question there?
Yeah, no. You're making perfect sense. I mean, I've not heard or read anything that says that, the FCC would push things in that direction, or that anybody thinks that that's a good policy move. But I think you might just only be a few steps ahead of people. And this goes back to what Keith was saying about, is it dangerous to use the wrong terminology? And I think Matt, I think you just made a great point. $42 billion, you're going to spend it the way we tell you to spend it, or at least you're going to spend it in ways that at the outer limits we say are acceptable. And if you're going to be spending $42 billion of public money, we don't necessarily want a competitor to be building out. We don't want to fund two networks when we're trying to get everybody one network, right?
Right.
Yep. So, I mean, they can. Sorry, what?
No, I was agreeing with you. This gets me excited. Sorry, I'm nerding out on what you're saying.
So I mean, that's a very legitimate point. And who knows where that goes. Now, Congress, the Republicans in Congress have always been pro-competition on this stuff, and it's hard to see them like switching horses that way. Most of the bigger companies are pretty comfortable. I mean, I was joking about Verizon earlier. I mean, they're pretty comfortable the way things work, and it would be hugely disruptive. But you could see how, it'd be like, well, within these certain areas, maybe some additional regulation should be required. So you could have a hybrid system, that says, if it's already covered by competition, we leave it alone. But if it's getting BEAD money, then over time, does more money have to be put in? Does the government try to assert more control? I mean, I have no idea, but it's a very legitimate point.
So let me ask you, Matt, when you're dealing with the owners, do you do any legal work for them in regards to other utilities?
We do not.
Okay. Because what would be, where I was going to go with that is I wonder what an owner's mind, like what are the implications in their head when they hear it called a utility, right? I mean, certainly if they're capitalizing on it and making money, a bell's got to go off that, whoa, I don't like that idea because my money goes away. But I wonder if there's other pain points or any implications in their mind when they hear it called a utility.
That's a good question. I'd have to talk to Art Hubacher and see if he's heard more about that. I tend to think not. I mean, I think that owners tend to look at it as, I mean, they would use the word loosely, with the kind of, raising the kind of concern that you've been talking about, because, but of course they don't deal with the regulatory side of it. They just deal with it as the service coming in, and from their perspective, whether you're regulated or not doesn't have any bearing really on them. I mean, we talked earlier about door fees or whatever, or revenue share, but so that would be something they might start to think about. But I think that they just use the term loosely, meaning we know everybody wants it, and so we got to find a way to provide it.
Well, can I ask you this then, Matt? Because my brain just exploded, right, with a bunch of questions, but I'll start with this one. When we talk about the magic wand game, it's a utility, like let's pretend it is or isn't, but the question begs to be asked then. Is it internet itself as the raw product, the utility, or is it the things that are also associated with it? And that goes back to what Keith was asking about managed Wi-Fi, because on the last conversations we had, is managed Wi-Fi the utility, etc. What I'm getting at is, we all know MDUs have pools, rooftop pool, backyard pool, whatever, right? Water is a utility, but no one's regulating them, saying you can't fill up a pool with that water and then use that pool as an asset. Right now, they're going to have monthly cleaning bills to clean that pool, to keep it nice. It's an asset in the community. So therefore, they feel they can charge, I don't know, $25 more per unit per month because they have an elite pool. That pool was filled with a utility. Now that pool is what you did with that utility or with that product, right? That water went in there, right? So anyway, you get what I'm getting at, right? We believe, Keith and I have had discussions on this, that Wi-Fi and the managed Wi-Fi is what you're doing with the internet. Just like gasoline. I can go buy gas. I can put it in a race car. I can put it in a Prius. I can put it in a generator. Water comes to my house. It can come out of the hose. It can come out of the shower head. It can come out of the sink. It can come out of my fridge. It goes in my ice maker. No one's regulating that. Anyways, I'm rambling now, but you get what I'm getting at there. I mean, where does it end?
Right. Well, yeah. So, I mean, if you think of the internet as a pipe, and the water company is providing a pipe, and one's delivering water and the other's delivering bits, that's definitely a good analogy. The difference, I think, is there are a couple things. One is who's paying for it, and is there an intermediary at the end of the pipe before it gets to the customer? And the water pipe goes right to the customer and right to the property owner or whoever, it comes out, and the property owner is paying for the water, and running that cost through in the rent. But there's no intermediary there as far as the resident user is concerned. They're paying for it, but as you're saying, no one's saying you can't take a shower now. We might get to that point, but they're not saying that now. Now, on the internet side, the managed Wi-Fi provider is the intermediary, right?
Right.
From the regulatory perspective, from the government's perspective, and also I think from the user's perspective, this is what I was saying earlier. The key thing is, do I have access to it at a rate that I think is reasonable, that I can afford? When we're talking about the bits coming in, there are different ways of distributing the bits. I don't think anybody is that concerned with whether it's managed Wi-Fi or fiber to the unit. I don't think they should be, as long as the resident is getting the capability that they can use. I don't know if I'm quite getting your point, Matt, but
you are, and again, that's what I'm saying. I think we could talk about this for hours. I don't want to take up that much of everybody's time, but then that's where the process of stifling innovation, to me, managed Wi-Fi almost goes away. And when I say goes away, it means that again, magic wand game, it's now a raw utility. The internet itself as a raw product is the utility, getting it to the unit, right? From there, it's like, okay, well, if I'm an owner and I want to implement managed Wi-Fi, the question is why? How do I make money on it, or what's in it for me? Well, it's a utility. It's got to be provided to the unit owner, which means they got to have control. They're the ones that have to pay for it. So then, okay, managed Wi-Fi from an owner providing point of view gets in the way, right? And now everything is on the single unit occupant, meaning the person inside the unit, meaning how their Wi-Fi operates, the robustness of the equipment that's hooked up to it, how it's distributed, does it connect to the IoT? That brings up another point. As a property owner, it's like, well, man, I should probably build my own separate network that only runs my IoT. And now it's more expensive for them because they can't recoup that cost.
Right.
Anyway,
yeah, the
IoT
thing. That's yeah.
Like I said, I'll be quiet now. It's literally a wrench in the gears from my perspective. Because it stifles all that stuff, and that's where we beg to ask the question of, is it dangerous to refer to it?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, you can see how, depending on the environment, some incumbent would have a motivation to go with managed Wi-Fi, as opposed to having, somebody like you all come in, but that raises the question of is it, how good is it and so forth. But if they're already in the building, it would have to be a cost. I don't know. You guys know the business a lot better than I do, but it seems to me there would have to be a cost benefit to both the owner and the provider. And in an existing property that's already wired, there's obviously less benefit. In a greenfield situation, maybe it makes sense if you're just not going to wire the building at all, and it's going to all be straight wireless. I don't know. I'm just talking off the top of my head, but the technological innovation point, I think, is you can't get around that. That's definitely a question.
Yeah. So let me ask this, and I'll ask it, paying you some compliments and stroking your ego a little bit. I'll be honest with you. When it comes to the industry and people that sit down, doing government affairs work and working with the FCC and going to DC, I don't think there's anybody more well respected than you, right? So, having said that,
you believe? It's true.
It's true, Matt. It's true. It's 100% true. But that being said, is it your opinion that the way we're doing it now, meaning in the industry, whether multifamily or not, the way the internet industry is done or regulated or lack thereof, do you believe we're doing it right today and it needs to remain the same? And if not, what would you change? What could we make better?
That's an interesting question. I'm a big believer in the market and in people responding to economic needs. And we've been pretty fortunate so far in the FCC, despite them doing things that I disagree with, and that on behalf of the apartment industry, we've fought against. They haven't done as much as they could have, or as much as people wanted them to do, and that's all been good. And part of that is because we've been able to show that it's a dynamic market and it's a competitive market, and that different people are doing different things, and that owners, one of the things that we really, really, really try to pound into the FCC's staff heads when we meet with them is that owners make rational decisions based on a range of issues, and they have if broadband is an essential service, which the FCC certainly believes, we've got lots of survey information. We've all seen the surveys of residents saying that it's really important to them, and MHC has done their own surveys on that. So there's a broad consensus that people want and need the service, and the market is doing that, and it's pushed it in different directions at different times. Managed Wi-Fi, it meets a lot of needs. And the FCC is not in a position to make those decisions based on a property by property basis. That's one issue. And I'm not that concerned about the FCC doing something super crazy, because I think they recognize, there's no question in fact, a lot of what the industry, apartment industry has been dealing with the last few years has been because the FCC does want to promote competition and new technology. And if you have some great new solution that you think will take over the world, you want to remove all the impediments that you can. And so you go to the FCC and say the property owners are getting in the way. And then the FCC has been listening to that. That's one of the reasons that, that I'm still employed. But I don't think that there's really, other than the point you brought up earlier, which I hadn't really thought about, but it's a really good one about the BEAD money and how that's going to be controlled. I don't think there's really a move towards anything other than, encouraging competition, and the FCC will keep an eye on it. And if anybody can make the case that someone's getting in the way of new technology being deployed, then they'll step in.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, awesome. And I really do appreciate this. I know we're coming up on the top of our time here, and we want to be respectful of your time. Matt, you were wonderful enough to agree to meet with Keith and I. Keith, do you have any other, we got a few minutes, Keith. Do you have any other questions for Matt or things you'd like him to drill down on?
I'm very happy he hasn't called me dumb yet. I'm doubly happy that he validated my fears of calling it a utility. And I'm just, again, appreciative of your time. Thanks for taking it with us.
No, I enjoyed it. I had a lot more fun than I knew I'd have fun, but I had a lot more fun than I expected. So
good.
This is, I think I may just take the rest of the day off. But what can they do?
Thank you. We do appreciate it. I'm glad you had fun.
Well, Matt,
worst case scenario, they're going to sue you, but you're educated enough for that. You can handle a lawsuit, right?
There you go. Well, Matt, look, if people want to learn more about HAT and everything else, how would they do that? Someone wants to follow up with you, get your advice, retain your services. What's the best way of getting in contact with you and learning more about you and your business?
The best thing to do is send me an email. I just sort of live on email. And it's my first initial, last name, MAMES at HAT Legal, hatlegal.com. I lost a fight on the hat thing. So Ames at hatlegal.com. And our website is, if you just Google Hubacher, Ames, and Taylor, you'll find us.
Excellent. Great group. I love working with your group. So awesome stuff. Well, Matt, again, thank you so very much for taking the time to meet with us here and have this discussion. It helps a lot. And I think that, we've gained some very, very valuable insight here. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, brother.
Okay.
Have your rest of the day. Take it off.
Yep.
Earned it.
Thanks.
Talk soon.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.